My name is Lori Jones. I'm 42 years old, a single mother, and when people ask if I'm close to my family, I usually smile and change the subject. Not because I'm ashamed, but because there's no clean way to explain what it feels like to grow up being tolerated instead of chosen. I'm not saying I had a tragic childhood. No abuse, no screaming matches, no dramatic cutoffs, just something quieter, something colder, the kind of neglect that never leaves bruises but still manages to shape every part of who you become. I built my life despite it, not because of it. I raised my son. I built a stable career. I stayed afloat after my divorce. But in my family's story, I was always the extra paragraph they skimmed. My son David is 14. He plays guitar, rolls his eyes like it's a competitive sport, and has this dry, devastating sense of humor that catches people off guard. He's my favorite person in the world, and not just because he's my kid. He's the only person in my family who has ever made me feel seen. It's been just us since his father walked away when David was 6. No dramatic exit, just a gradual disappearance. One missed pickup, one unanswered call until it became clear I was doing this alone. And I did. I have one sibling, my older sister Melissa Jones. She's 45, a corporate attorney, married to a man named Robert with 2 kids and a house that looks like it was designed by a branding committee. White walls, matching furniture, seasonal wreaths. The kind of place where nothing feels lived in, but everything looks impressive. Melissa has always been admired, celebrated, the center of gravity. Growing up, she got the bigger room, the newer car, the expensive college. I got the leftovers, the maybe next time. Our parents never said it outright, but they never had to. Favoritism doesn't need an announcement. It just needs repetition. When our parents passed away, that dynamic didn't fade. It hardened. Melissa married Robert when I was in my early 30s. He's polite in a way that feels rehearsed. Her in-laws are worse, especially her mother-in-law, Diane, who can insult you while smiling warmly and somehow make it feel like you should thank her for the experience. I've never been outright rude to them. I've just never quite belonged. Over the years, family gatherings became performances. Birthdays, holidays, obligations. Melissa's kids received thoughtful gifts and enthusiastic attention. David got last-minute gift cards and distracted smiles. I stayed quiet longer than I should have. But kids notice. And once David asked me why his aunt always forgot his birthday, I couldn't pretend anymore. Which brings me to last weekend. It was Melissa and Robert's 15th wedding anniversary, and they were hosting a small, elegant dinner at an upscale restaurant downtown. One of those places with dim lighting, linen tablecloths, and a wine list thicker than most novels. I wasn't invited. Not directly. I found out through my cousin Rachel, who texted me asking if David and I were coming. She assumed we were included. We weren't, and normally I would have let it go. That's what I always do. But David had just come back from a summer program he loved. He was happy, open, and I thought maybe this could be a reset, a chance to remind Melissa that we still existed. So I texted her. Casual, polite, no pressure. Her response came an hour later. Sure, if there's space. We're doing 7 Hornet Verde. Not warm, but not a no. So I took a breath and said yes. And that was the moment everything started to change. I didn't tell David that the invitation was vague. I didn't want him walking into the night already braced for disappointment. I just told him we were meeting family for dinner, and he nodded, grabbed a clean button-down from his closet, and asked if black sneakers were restaurant acceptable now. We laughed. It felt normal. That should have been my first warning. We arrived at Verde 5 minutes early. The place was already buzzing, soft jazz humming through hidden speakers. The clink of glasses, the low murmur of people who'd paid too much for appetizers and wanted everyone to know it. White linen tablecloths, candlelight, everything curated to feel exclusive without trying too hard. Melissa was already there. She stood near the table, talking to the waiter. Posture, perfect smile, sharp. Robert sat beside her parents-in-law, Diane, already holding a flute of something pink and expensive. Their kids were glued to their phones, barely looking up. It looked exactly like I'd imagined it would, polished, complete, self-contained. Melissa saw us before I reached the table. Her smile flickered, not warm, not hostile, just surprised, like she hadn't expected us to actually show up. Hey, I said, keeping my voice light. David smiled automatically. Hi, Aunt Melissa. She didn't respond right away. Her eyes moved from David to me, then to the table. The waiter was already pulling out 2 extra chairs. That's when she lifted her hand. There's only room for 6, she said. I actually laughed. a short, reflexive sound. That's funny, I said. When I called earlier, they said the reservation was for 8. She glanced at the waiter, then back at me. There were some last-minute changes. David looked up at me, confused. I felt it then, the familiar tightening in my chest. The same feeling I'd had 100 times growing up, standing on the edge of something I wasn't quite allowed into. Maybe next time, Melissa added, her voice lowered, just enough to sound polite. And Lori, don't just show up. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The message landed cleanly. No one stood up. No one said, we can squeeze in. Diane stared into her glass like it held state secrets. Robert shifted in his seat but didn't speak. The waiter froze, unsure whether to keep pulling out chairs or slide them back in. I smiled. I've perfected that smile over decades. The one that says I'm fine even when I'm not. The one that keeps the peace. I put my hand on David's shoulder. No worries, I said. Let's find somewhere else. We turned away from the table and walked toward the bar. I was already pulling out my phone, searching for nearby restaurants, mentally calculating how to make this feel like a choice instead of a rejection. That's when the waiter caught my eye. Give me 2 minutes, he said quietly. He disappeared through a side door. David and I stood there awkwardly pretending to look at the drink menu. I could feel Melissa's gaze on my back, or maybe I imagined it. Either way, it didn't matter. I was already tired. Then the waiter came back smiling. The owner says there's a private booth available, he said. Corner table, on the house. I blinked. I'm sorry, what? He remembers you, the waiter continued. Said you helped him a while back. Investment advice. He insisted. David's eyebrows shot up. You know the owner. I shook my head slowly, still processing. I helped him with some portfolio stuff years ago. The waiter gestured toward a dimly lit corner booth. It was easily the best seat in the restaurant. Quiet, spacious, tucked away, but with a full view of the room. Right this way. As we followed him, I felt it the shift. Not triumph, not revenge, just weightlifting. Like something heavy had finally moved off my chest. Champagne arrived within minutes. For David's sparkling cider. The waiter winked and said it was the chef's compliment. I didn't look at Melissa's table right away. I didn't need to. I could feel it. The tension, the confusion, the loss of control. And for the first time in a very long time, I didn't shrink. I just sat there with my son, lifted my glass, and let the night unfold. The champagne flutes landed softly on the table, crystal kissing linen, with a sound so delicate it almost felt intentional. Everything about that booth felt intentional. The lighting hit just right, warm without being dim. The leather seats were deep and comfortable, the kind you sank into instead of perching on. From where we sat, we could see nearly the entire restaurant, including Melissa's table, without being on display ourselves. David stared at the glass in front of him, then at me. Champagne, he whispered, half amused, half nervous. Sparkling cider, I said, nudging his glass gently toward him. You're still underage rock star. The waiter leaned in with a grin. Chef's compliments for our VIP guests. VIP. I didn't miss the way Melissa's head snapped up across the room at that exact moment. She'd been mid-sentence, with Diane's lips moving in that tight, controlled way she used when she wanted to look pleasant but was already irritated. Her eyes locked onto the tray in the waiter's hands, then tracked it straight to our table. She saw the champagne. She saw the booth. She saw David laughing as he took his first sip of cider. Her smile froze. Melissa had always hated surprises, especially ones she couldn't manage, couldn't spin, couldn't fold neatly into her version of events. And here we were, me and David suddenly visible in a way she hadn't authorized. I didn't wave. I didn't look over deliberately. I just focused on my son on the menu, on the quiet hum of a place that for once wasn't asking me to prove I belonged. At first, I told myself we'd eat quickly and leave, that this was just a nice recovery from an awkward start. But then the owner himself appeared. He came out from behind the bar with the easy confidence of someone who knew everyone in the room wanted his approval. He stopped at our table, shook my hand warmly, and smiled at David. Lori Jones, he said, it's been a while. I stood instinctively. You didn't have to do all this. He waved it off. You saved me from a terrible investment years ago. Least I can do. This booth's always yours. Always. Something inside me shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to notice. Across the room, Melissa leaned toward Robert, whispering something sharp. Their son nudged her, pointing at our table. Her daughter followed his gaze. Diane glanced over once, twice, then deliberately looked away. The contrast was brutal. At Melissa's table, everything was stiff, controlled. Their kids poked at appetizers, bored. Robert nodded through conversation he'd clearly had 100 times before. Diane sipped her drink like it was a prop. At our table, David was animated, telling me about a song he was learning, tapping rhythms on the table with his fingers. I laughed, actually laughed, not the polite, restrained version I'd mastered, but the kind that slipped out when you weren't bracing for judgment. Our food arrived quickly. Steak for me, salmon for David, perfectly cooked. A few minutes later, the waiter returned with a bottle of vintage red wine. "This is from Mr. Callahan," he said, nodding toward the owner. He insisted. David leaned in, eyes wide. "Mom, how do you know him?" I shrugged, keeping my voice casual. I gave him some honest advice when he needed it. Didn't charge him. Sometimes that matters. David grinned. "So, karma," maybe I said. I could feel eyes on us now. Not just Melissa's, her parents-in-law's, other diners. Whispers flickered across the room like static. Nothing overt, just curiosity, quiet recalibration. Halfway through dinner, the waiter returned again. "The chef wanted to know if your son would like to try the chocolate souffle," he said. "It's not on the menu, but we can have it ready in 15 minutes. David froze. "Seriously?" Then he glanced at me, hesitating. "Mom, this feels like a lot. Are we stealing their night?" The question hit harder than I expected. I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "We're just having dinner," I said gently. But inside I knew the truth was more complicated. Because I wasn't doing anything. I wasn't confronting Melissa. I wasn't raising my voice or calling out her behavior. I was simply existing in comfort, in visibility, in respect. And that alone was unraveling something she'd spent years carefully constructing. When David excused himself to the restroom, a shadow fell over the table. I looked up. Melissa stood there. She didn't speak at first, just stared at the booth, at the wine, at the plates. Her smile was stretched so tight it looked painful. "Nice table," she said finally. "Yeah," I replied calmly. "Didn't expect it." She nodded slowly. "Interesting." I gestured to the empty seat across from me. "Want to sit?" Her eyes flicked to the chair, then back to me. "No." I just wanted to say, "I hope you didn't feel excluded earlier." I tilted my head. "You mean when you told us there was only room for 6 at a table set for 8? Her jaw tightened. "You didn't RSVP. I wasn't invited." She let out a small, dismissive laugh. "It wasn't formal, Lori. We assumed people would understand it was family only." I set my fork down. "I am family." For a split second, the mask slipped. Then she leaned in, lowering her voice. "You know how Diane gets about logistics, and her parents aren't spontaneous. It was just easier." "Easier," I repeated. She straightened, glanced toward her table. "We're doing cake soon, if you want to swing by." "I think we're good here," I said. For the first time that night, Melissa had no response. She walked away stiffly, shoulders squared, heels clicking sharply against the floor. David returned moments later, blissfully unaware, and dove into his souffle like it was the best thing he'd ever tasted. We talked about music, movies, school, life. It felt good. And then quietly the night took another turn. We finished dinner slowly. Not because we were trying to make a point, but because for once there was no rush. No one waiting for our table. No one signaling that our time was up. David leaned back in the booth, full and happy, talking through a potential band name like it was a life or death decision. I listened, nodded, laughed at the right moments, committing the sound of his excitement to memory. I paid attention to everything except Melissa. That wasn't intentional. It was instinct. Years of conditioning had trained me to track her moods, anticipate her reactions, brace for her judgments. Tonight, for the first time, I didn't. I let the background blur. When we stood to leave, the waiter thanked us again. I slipped a generous tip into the folder. Not because I felt obligated, but because the service had been kind in a way that went beyond professionalism. As we stepped out of the booth, I felt lighter than I had in years. That's when the owner appeared again. He smiled broadly. "Leaving so soon? Big day tomorrow," I said. "But thank you, truly. That was more than generous." He waved his hand dismissively. "Nonsense. Always happy to take care of good people." Then he paused, brow furrowing slightly. "Oh, almost forgot. We ran your sister's card when you arrived." I stopped. "Sorry," I asked. He chuckled. "The reservation was under her name. Large party. We usually put everything on one tab unless told otherwise. We assumed you were all together." For a moment I couldn't speak. Everything, the champagne, the wine, the souffle, the private booth, had been charged to Melissa's card. I opened my mouth to correct him, to explain, to make it right. And then I didn't, because something in me shifted again, not toward anger, not toward satisfaction, toward clarity. I thought about the years of being overlooked, about David sitting quietly while his cousins tore into stacks of presents, about forgotten birthdays. About being told maybe next time so often it stopped sounding temporary. About standing beside that table earlier while Melissa calmly said there was only room for 6. I closed my mouth. Okay, I said softly. The owner smiled. Great, take care, Lori. David and I stepped out into the cool night air. The city hummed around us, alive and indifferent. As we walked toward the car, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I didn't check it. Not yet. David glanced up at me. That was kind of insane, he said, in a good way. I smiled. Yeah. We drove home in comfortable silence. I tucked him in, listened as he rambled sleepily about the souffle, about how maybe Sundays should always be restaurant nights. I told him I loved him. He mumbled something unintelligible and passed out. Then I sat alone in the living room and waited for the guilt. It didn't come. Instead, my phone lit up again. Melissa. I let it ring. Then a text appeared. Did you know the bill was charged to my card? Another buzz. Lori, this is not okay. I stared at the ceiling, breathing slowly. This hadn't been revenge. Not consciously. I hadn't planned it. I hadn't orchestrated anything. I'd simply stopped shrinking. And for the first time, the cost of that decision had landed somewhere else. I went to bed without responding. The next morning, my phone was a graveyard of missed calls and messages. Melissa, Robert, a family group chat that suddenly seemed very active. The accusations were immediate and loud. I embarrassed her. I hijacked her anniversary. I showed up uninvited. I stuck her with a massive bill. I read them once, then twice. And then I put the phone down. Because beneath the noise, beneath the outrage, something else was settling in. A quiet, unmistakable understanding. That dinner wasn't the problem. It was the final proof. And whatever came next, whatever fallout waited on the other side of that silence, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going back to the way things were. The fallout came fast. By the time David left for school that morning, my phone was still vibrating on the kitchen counter like it couldn't decide whether to explode or give up. I didn't answer a single call. I skimmed the messages once more, just enough to confirm what I already knew. Melissa wasn't asking what happened. She was telling everyone what she decided had happened. By noon, I was removed from the family group chat. Not muted, not ignored, removed. David, too. His name disappeared right alongside mine like an administrative cleanup. That part hurt more than I expected. I could take being cut off. I'd been emotionally preparing for that my whole life. But cutting out my son, who hadn't said a single wrong word, felt deliberate. Punitive. That afternoon, my cousin Rachel called. Laurie, what happened at the dinner? She asked carefully. I told her the truth. Not defensively, not emotionally, just the facts. Some people believe me. Most didn't want to decide. And some Melissa's orbit had already chosen. Within days, the story had grown teeth. I heard versions of it through secondhand whispers. That I'd shown up drunk. That I'd demanded special treatment. That I'd manipulated the staff. That I'd tried to make the night about me. David came home from school quiet one afternoon. Too quiet. My cousin told people you got kicked out of a restaurant, he said, watching my face carefully. Said you made a scene. I felt something surge in my chest. Hot, sharp, protective. Do you believe that? He snorted. Please. You didn't even complain when they messed up your steak. That was the moment I understood something important. I didn't need to correct the story. I just needed to live outside it. Still, things got worse before they got better. The invitations stopped entirely. No birthdays, no holidays. Thanksgiving came and went in silence. Christmas followed colder than ever. I mailed gifts anyway because the kids hadn't done anything wrong. They were returned unopened. A single sticky note on the box. Not necessary. I stood in the kitchen staring at that note for a long time. It felt final in a way nothing else had. Not dramatic, just decisive, like a door closing softly without ceremony. That was rock bottom. And strangely, it was also freedom. I stopped explaining, stopped defending, stopped hoping someone would suddenly understand. All that energy went somewhere else. Into work, into David, into rebuilding a sense of worth that had never been rooted in their approval to begin with. I took on bigger clients, the kind Melissa used to joke were too boring for her taste. I doubled my revenue in 6 months. I stopped shrinking my accomplishments to make others comfortable. David and I started a Sunday ritual, trying a new restaurant every week. Just us. No expectations, no politics, just food and conversation and laughter. It became our thing. One night, while tuning his guitar, David looked up at me and said, "You know, I like our life better this way." I raised an eyebrow. "What way?" He shrugged. "The one where we don't have to pretend." I smiled, and something inside me settled. I thought the story ended there. I was wrong, because Melissa wasn't done. And I was about to learn that when people lose control in private, they try to reclaim it in public. Melissa didn't come after me right away. That should have warned me. Her silence stretched on for weeks after Christmas, long enough that I started to believe she'd written me off entirely. And part of me hoped that was true. I was busy rebuilding, healing, learning what it felt like to move through life without constantly checking over my shoulder. When Melissa goes quiet, though, it's never because she's moved on. It's because she's planning. I found out by accident. I was at a working lunch with a new client, a boutique real estate firm, run by a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Elena Brooks. We were halfway through discussing portfolio diversification when she leaned back, folded her arms, and said casually, "By the way, is your sister still with Larchmont Legal?" My fork froze midair. "Yes. Why?" Elena shrugged. "She stopped by our office last week, said you referred her." My stomach dropped. "I didn't," I said immediately. Elena studied my face for a beat, then nodded. That's what I thought. I waited. "She said you were stretched thin lately," Elena continued, choosing her words carefully. "That you were a great advisor, but juggling a lot with a teenage son and all. Suggested we might be better off with someone who had more availability." I felt heat crawl up my neck. Not rage. Recognition. Melissa wasn't shouting. She wasn't confronting me. She was doing what she'd always done best, editing the narrative quietly just enough to make people doubt me without ever looking malicious. She even mentioned the restaurant, Elena added. Framed it like you'd taken advantage of her generosity. There it was. I finished my lunch in silence, thanked Elena for her honesty, and walked back to my car, feeling like the ground had shifted under my feet. This wasn't family drama anymore. This was professional sabotage. Over the next 2 weeks, I started noticing patterns. A former contact asking why I'd passed on a project I'd never heard of. A lukewarm response from a potential client who'd been enthusiastic just days earlier. Subtle hesitations. Quiet distance. Melissa was using my name as leverage. Not just once, repeatedly. She wasn't burning bridges. She was repainting them just enough to redirect traffic away from me and toward herself. I stopped being surprised and started documenting. Every mention, every crossed wire, every your sister said. I kept notes, screenshots, dates, times. I wasn't planning to sue her. That wasn't my style, but I wasn't going to be defenseless either. One night after dinner, I sat David down. Not to involve him as a pawn, never that, but because he deserved the truth. "I need to ask you something," I said gently. "Do you miss them?" He thought about it for a long time. "I used to," he said finally, "but I think I just miss the idea of them." That answer broke something open in me and sealed something shut. From that point on, everything I did was intentional. I rebranded my consulting practice. New name, new website, no family associations. I stopped minimizing my success and started owning it. I hired a part-time assistant. I said yes to projects I would have talked myself out of a year earlier. David started thriving too. He launched a small music channel online, just covers and tutorials at first. I helped him with lighting and editing. His subscriber count climbed faster than either of us expected. Meanwhile, I began redirecting opportunities. When a tech startup asked if I knew a reliable legal firm, I didn't hesitate. I recommended Priya Mehta, a brilliant attorney I'd met at a networking event. No ego, no theatrics, just integrity. She landed the client within 3 weeks. Word spread. Melissa didn't know it yet, but threads were loosening. The web she'd woven around herself, built on perception and borrowed credibility, was starting to fray. And then unexpectedly, an email arrived that told me something had cracked on her side too. It was from Diane's husband. Subject line, coffee. I stared at it for a long time before opening it. Because when people who value image above all else reach out quietly, it's never just about guilt. It's about damage control. And that was when I knew the balance was finally shifting. I almost deleted the email. Not because I was afraid of what Malcolm Melissa's father-in-law had to say, but because I was tired. Tired of conversations that came too late. Tired of people suddenly finding their conscience once the damage had already been done. But something in his wording stopped me. I've been thinking about that dinner for a while. People like Malcolm didn't think unless there was a reason. So I agreed to meet. We chose a quiet cafe on the east side, the kind of place with chipped mugs and no background music. Malcolm arrived early. He looked older than I remembered. His suit was still tailored, still expensive, but his posture was slightly slumped, like he'd been carrying weight longer than he wanted to admit. "I owe you an apology," he said before I could even sit down. I waited. "I should have said something that night," he continued. "The way Melissa treated you, it wasn't right. The word treated lingered between us. I saw the security footage, he added, lowering his voice. I asked the owner for it. That got my attention. He slid his phone across the table. I didn't watch the video. I didn't need to. I already knew what it showed. You didn't argue, Malcolm said. You didn't raise your voice. You smiled. You left. He exhaled slowly. That kind of restraint, you don't see it often. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. He hesitated. Melissa approached me about a venture, real estate hedge. She said you were backing it. I let out a short, humorless laugh. I'm not. I know, he said. That's why I'm here. Silence settled comfortably between us. If you ever need support, Malcolm said finally, financial or otherwise, you have it. I didn't thank him. I didn't promise anything. I just nodded. That was enough. From that moment on, I stopped hiding. I organized everything. Timelines, referrals, misrepresentations, patterns. Not to expose Melissa publicly, but to be ready. And then Malcolm reached out again. I have an industry panel coming up, he said over the phone. Real estate finance, legal partnerships. I want you on it. Melissa will be there, I said. I know. So would her firm. So would her clients. So would people who believed her version of events. I agreed. The event was held at a luxury hotel downtown. Glass walls, steel accents, a room full of people who cared deeply about how things looked. David came with me. He'd never seen me in that world before. You nervous? He asked as I adjusted my jacket. No, I said honestly. I'm ready. Melissa spoke first. She was polished, confident, smooth. She talked about ethics, leadership, family values. The irony nearly made me laugh. When it was my turn, I didn't talk about numbers. I told a story about exclusion, about quiet resilience, about what leadership looks like when no one's watching. I didn't say her name. I didn't need to. The room was silent when I finished. Afterward, Malcolm introduced me to a development firm Melissa had been chasing for months. They shook my hand, asked questions, took notes. Melissa watched from across the room, her smile cracking for the first time in years. That was when the gravity shifted. The investigation that followed wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. A junior partner at Melissa's firm submitted a complaint. The board reviewed referral claims. Connections were checked, stories unraveled. Melissa wasn't disbarred, but she was asked to step down. Quietly. Publicly, it was a transition. Privately, everyone knew. When a Polaroid arrived in the mail weeks later, faces scratched out no return address, I didn't feel vindicated. I felt finished. Because the truth doesn't need fireworks. It just needs space. Melissa never called. No apology, no explanation, no attempt to reframe what happened once the ground gave way beneath her. People like her don't apologize when they're exposed. They disappear, regroup, and pretend the story ended differently than it did. But the unraveling didn't happen all at once. It happened the way these things always do, in professional circles, quietly, efficiently, and in plain sight if you knew where to look. The development firm Malcolm introduced me to stopped returning Melissa's emails. Then they stopped returning her calls. When she followed up, she received a single line in response. We've decided to move in a different direction. No justification, no feedback, just a closed door. Then came the audit. It wasn't announced. It wasn't publicized. But word spreads fast when partners stop making eye contact and junior associates start whispering. One of Melissa's own colleagues, someone she'd underestimated for years, had finally had enough of watching her blur lines, inflate connections, and use other people's credibility like currency. The internal review confirmed what I'd already documented privately. Exaggerated referrals, borrowed names, implied endorsements that never existed. Nothing flashy enough for criminal charges, just enough to destroy trust. Larchmont Legal released a carefully worded statement about restructuring leadership and recommitting to integrity. Melissa's name was absent from the future. Her social media shifted tone overnight. Vague posts about clearing toxic energy, about protecting family peace, about new beginnings. Comments dwindled. Invitations slowed. The curated life she'd built, so dependent on perception, lost its audience. Extended family reached out tentatively. Apologies were rare, but acknowledgement wasn't. Cousin Rachel texted, "You were right. I'm sorry I didn't believe you sooner." Even David noticed the shift. One afternoon, he showed me a message from his cousin. "My mom's been acting weird lately. I think she got caught doing something shady. You and your mom were always cooler anyway." David smiled, not smug, not vindicated, just calm. "Guess truth wins," he said. We never heard from Melissa again, but closure came in an unexpected way. A letter arrived, no return address. Inside was the Polaroid from the anniversary dinner, the one where David and I weren't included. Only now 2 faces had been scratched out. Melissa's. Robert's. No note, no explanation. I stared at it for a long time, then slid it into a drawer and closed it. David's channel passed 50,000 subscribers that spring. He played his first local show. I stood in the crowd watching him on stage, remembering the kid who once asked why his aunt forgot his birthday. I expanded the firm, hired 2 associates, traveled for the first time in years, not to prove anything, but because I finally could. The family I thought I needed never really existed, but the one I built quiet, honest, earned did. And I didn't burn Melissa's world down. She did. I just stepped out of the way and let everyone see the smoke. After everything settled, after the calls stopped and the whispers faded, there was a strange quiet that followed me around for a while. Not loneliness, not grief, just space. The kind you don't realize you've been craving until it finally appears. I used to think closure came with conversations, tearful apologies, dramatic acknowledgments, people finally admitting they were wrong. But none of that happened, and it didn't need to, because the truth had already done its work. Melissa never reached out again. No attempt to rewrite the ending. No sudden vulnerability. She vanished into the version of her life where this chapter simply didn't exist, and that told me everything I needed to know. The silence wasn't punishment, it was confirmation. What surprised me most was how little I missed her. Not her exactly, but the idea of what she represented, the fantasy that one day she'd look at me and see an equal, a sister, someone worth including without hesitation. Letting go of that hope felt like setting down a weight I'd been carrying since childhood. David noticed the change in me before I did. "You're different," he said one night as we cleaned up after dinner. "Better or worse?" I asked. He thought about it. Lighter. He was right. Without the constant background noise of trying to belong somewhere I never truly fit, my life simplified. Decisions got clearer. Joy came easier. I didn't rehearse conversations in my head anymore. I didn't flinch when my phone buzzed. We kept our Sunday tradition. New restaurants. New stories. Sometimes we talked about the past. Sometimes we didn't. The difference was that now it didn't define us. Extended family still existed at a distance. Some relationships softened. Others stayed quiet. I stopped measuring that as a failure. Not everyone is meant to walk with you forever. Some people are just meant to teach you where your boundaries are. One afternoon, while sorting old papers, I found the Polaroid again. The scratched out faces. The frozen moment of exclusion. I held it for a while, then finally threw it away. I didn't need proof anymore. Family, I learned, isn't about blood or history or obligation. It's about who shows up when there's nothing to gain, who pulls out a chair instead of counting seats, who makes space without being asked. For years, I thought I was the extra piece in someone else's picture. Turns out I was just standing in the wrong frame. And once I stepped out of it, everything came into focus.